All right, welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The American Homefront During World War II. There's a lot to know about the American Homefront in World War II, so we can't cover it all today, but we'll try to cover 5 things that are important for you to know to start thinking about what was life like, in America at that time. So the first would be war production, right? Much of the American economy as the war begins, shifts to producing goods for the American military and for our allies during the conflict. The American economy when the war began had been at about 50% of its capacity. By the time you get to the tail end of the war, our unemployment rates are under 1%. Prices rose for a lot of things, but wages rose too. And this was a very, very big part of living in America at this time. Secondly, the goods, the tools, the weapons, all these things that America is producing would be another. And an example of that would be the Liberty ship. America produced things with a mass production mentality, a Fordism mentality during World War II. Produce as many of them as you can, and this will help to overwhelm the enemies that you are facing. Given America's geographic position, if we were going to be meeting the supply needs of our allies and of our own armed forces, we would need to be shipping things commonly and constantly. Liberty ships were cargo ships, quickly built, sturdy, that got the job done. We could produce one, I think, every something like 17 days. They had a contest to produce one, like they did it in like 4 days. I mean, we really, really produce things quickly here. Thirdly, rationing and American support. So America's economy does great things during World War II, but it's not without limits for the American population. There is rationing. There's gas rationing, there's food rationing. Americans would have little ration books where you would get stamps, that you could use for things. Different goods were collected. Different kinds of fats were collected to help with the creation of explosives, this kind of thing. And so public support then, again, was there. It existed. There was an active encouragement for Americans to be prideful about their service in the war and support the war. But we should, of course, note that not everyone was fully supportive. Not everyone felt that their interests were being fully respected as Americans during this time. And so a fourth thing for us to be aware of would be riots. And there are 2 kinds of them to highlight for our purposes here. The first were race riots as it relates to African Americans. So the Pittsburgh Courier and other African American newspapers during the Second World War wrote of something that they called the Double V campaign. This idea of victory against fascism abroad and against horrific and brutal racism at home. The Jim Crow system was still alive and well during World War II. It hadn't ended. And so you saw race riots in Harlem and in the city of Detroit during particularly the summer of 1943 that highlighted a number of these issues. Another example of racial conflict and ethnic conflict that you would see during the war was what were known as the Zoot Suit riots. Now, Zoot Suits were popular suits in the early 1940s, primarily amongst young men, and there was an assumption in parts of California that young Latino men wearing these suits were flouting the rationing and flouting the sort of structures of service and of the day. And given the racism of the time, many of them were targeted for brutal attacks by young white men. So these are known as the Zoot Suit riots in 1943. Something else for us to note really is twofold. The first is something called the Bracero program, and the other is internment. So during World War II, the United States government supports the creation of something called the Bracero program, where Mexican men, laborers, cross the border into the U.S. to work as farm laborers with the idea that this would free up positions so that Americans could go and could join the service. Secondly, the internment of Japanese Americans, which occurs during World War II. The President approves this with an executive order, and it's carried out for much of the duration of the war. Japanese Americans, individuals of Japanese ancestry, over 100,000 of them, are put into internment camps primarily in the western sort of areas of the U.S. and the southwestern areas of the United States, in a process that was racial in nature and for which there was no justification. Thank you very much.